What happens when a gate agent humiliates an elderly veteran, denying him his business class seat? You won't believe how a pilot's bold stand turns the tables, leaving the entire airport stunned. I stood there in the middle of Concourse B at Denver International Airport, the late afternoon sun pouring through the glass walls like it was trying to burn away the chaos of the day. The terminal was a hive of noise. Kids whining, suitcases rattling, and the endless drone of announcements over the PA system. Gate 47 was no different, packed with folks itching to board Flight 392 to Seattle. Me? I was just trying to get to my seat in business class, 3A, with nothing but my old leather satchel and a boarding pass I'd triple-checked before leaving my little house on Juniper Ridge Road in Arvada. My name's Vernon Hollis, 78 years young, and I've seen enough of this world to know when trouble's brewing. And trouble was brewing, all right, though I didn't know it yet. My blazer, navy and a touch faded, hung loose on my frame. Not because I'm frail, mind you, but because I've never been one for showy clothes. The white shirt beneath it was crisp, pressed just that morning, and my shoes, though scuffed from years of wear, were polished enough to pass muster. I moved slow, not out of weakness, but because I've learned to take my time, to notice the little things. Like the young woman a few steps ahead of me, her arms loaded with shopping bags, her toddler tugging at her sleeve like he was ready to sprint for the hills. She looked frazzled, her dark hair slipping from its bun, her eyes darting between her kid and the gate. I've been around long enough to know that look. Pure exhaustion. The kind that makes you feel like you're drowning in plain sight. "Ma'am," I said, stepping closer, my voice low but clear. "Need a hand with those bags?" I gave her a smile, the kind I used to give my daughter when she was small, before she grew up and moved to Seattle with her own kids. She glanced at me, startled, like she wasn't used to kindness from strangers. "Oh no, thank you, I'm okay," she said, but her voice cracked, betraying the lie. Her son, maybe 3 years old, was bouncing on his toes, pointing at a coffee kiosk with neon signs screaming about pumpkin spice lattes. I knelt down to his level, ignoring the faint ache in my knees. "You like airplanes, little man?" I asked. His eyes lit up, big and brown, like he'd just been handed the keys to a candy store. I reached into my satchel, past the folded photograph and the worn paperback I always carry, and pulled out a small plastic model of a P-51 Mustang. The paint was chipped, the propeller a bit bent, but it was a treasure from my days as a pilot, something I kept for moments like this. "This one flew a long time ago," I told him, handing it over. "Keep it safe, okay?" The boy's grin could have lit up the whole terminal. His mother's face softened, and she mouthed a quiet, "Thank you," as I stood, brushing off my blazer. "That's real kind of you," she said, her voice steadier now. "Not many folks would do that." I waved it off. "Just passing on a little history," I said, and turned toward the jetway. I didn't see the eyes watching me from the check-in counter, sharp and calculating, belonging to a gate agent named Tyler Kendrick. He was in his mid-30s, with slicked-back hair and a badge pinned crookedly to his vest, tapping a pen like he was keeping score. To him, I reckon I didn't look like much. Just an old man in a worn jacket. Not the kind of fella who belongs in business class with the suits and their shiny carry-ons. If I'd known what he was thinking, I might have braced myself. But life doesn't give you warnings like that, does it? I shuffled toward the jetway, my boarding pass in hand, the weight of my satchel comforting against my side. The line was moving slow, folks fumbling with their phones and passports. I could feel the impatience in the air, like a storm brewing. When I reached the scanner, I handed my pass to Tyler, expecting the usual beep and nod. Instead, he held it up, squinting at it like it was written in code. His lips curled into a smirk, the kind that says he's already made up his mind about you. "Sir," he said, loud enough for the folks behind me to turn their heads, "I'm gonna need you to step aside. There's an issue with your ticket." His tone was polite, but it had an edge, like he was daring me to argue. I frowned, my fingers tightening on the satchel. "I booked that ticket 3 weeks ago," I said, keeping my voice even. "It's business class, seat 3A. I've got the confirmation email if you need it." Tyler didn't even look at me. He scanned the pass again, his eyes flicking to the screen, then back to me, lingering on my blazer, my shoes, my gray hair. "The system's showing a discrepancy," he said, louder now, like he wanted an audience. "Business class is for priority passengers, sir. You understand?" The word "sir" didn't sound respectful coming from him. It sounded like a jab, like he was saying I didn't belong. I felt the eyes of the crowd on me. Some curious, some annoyed, like I was the one holding up their day. A man in a tailored suit behind me sighed, muttering something about delays. A woman with a laptop on her knee glanced up, her expression caught between pity and impatience. "I understand you've got a job to do," I said, keeping my cool, though I could feel a familiar heat rising in my chest. "But I paid for that seat, same as anyone else. Check your system again." Tyler's smirk widened, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice like we were sharing a secret. "Look, Pops, let's not make a scene. Step over here and we'll sort it out." He gestured to a corner near the counter where a security officer named Dwayne Carver stood, arms crossed, his bulk filling the space like a wall. Dwayne's face was neutral, but his eyes were sharp, watching me like I might bolt. I didn't move. "I'm not making a scene," I said, my voice steady but firm, the way I used to speak to green recruits back in '68. "I'm asking you to honor my ticket." The air got heavier, the crowd's murmurs growing louder. Tyler's face hardened, and he raised his voice again. "Sir, I'm not asking. Step aside, or I'm calling security." He nodded at Dwayne, who started toward me, his boots heavy on the floor. The young mother I'd helped earlier pushed through the crowd, her son clutching the toy plane. "This man didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice shaking but loud. "He was kind to my boy. Why are you treating him like this?" Tyler ignored her, his eyes locked on me. "Last chance, sir," he said, the word dripping with contempt. I reached into my blazer pocket, my fingers brushing the faded photograph I always carried. Me, 30 years old, in my pilot's uniform, standing proud in front of an F-4 Phantom in Da Nang. I held it out to Tyler, not because I thought it'd change his mind, but because I wanted him to see who he was dealing with. "This is me," I said, my voice low, almost a growl. "I flew combat missions in Vietnam. 32 of them. I earned that seat, son, and I don't appreciate being treated like a fraud." Tyler barely glanced at the photo. "Nice story," he said, tossing it back like it was junk mail. "Doesn't change the system. Step aside." The crowd gasped, a low collective sound that made my skin prickle. The woman with the laptop was filming now, her phone angled to catch every word. The man in the suit muttered something about entitlement, but his voice lacked conviction. Dwayne reached me, his hand hovering near my shoulder. "Let's go, sir," he said, his tone flat but not unkind. "No need for trouble." I looked at him, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe doubt, maybe recognition. But he was just doing his job, same as Tyler. I didn't resist, but I didn't look away either. "You're making a mistake," I said quietly, my voice carrying a weight I hadn't used in years. As Dwayne guided me to the side, the crowd's murmurs turned to whispers, some outraged, some indifferent. The young mother stayed where she was, her son's toy plane still in his hand, her eyes burning with something like anger. "This isn't right," she said to no one in particular, but loud enough for the suit behind her to hear. He shrugged, adjusting his tie like it was armor. "Rules are rules," he said. But his voice wavered. I stood by the counter, my satchel at my feet, my heart steady but heavy. I'd faced worse than this. Enemy fire, burning skies, nights wondering if I'd see dawn. But there's something about being dismissed in front of a crowd, treated like you're nothing, that cuts deeper than shrapnel. Tyler was back at the counter, scanning passes like nothing had happened, his smirk firmly in place. Dwayne stood nearby, shifting his weight, like he wasn't sure he belonged here either. Then a new voice cut through the noise, sharp and authoritative. "What's going on here?" A woman in her 50s, dressed in a crisp blazer, strode toward the counter. Her badge read Marissa Delgado, Regional Supervisor, Cascade Airways. Her eyes scanned the scene. Tyler's smug face, Dwayne's unease, the crowd's restless energy, and me, standing there with my satchel and my pride. "Mr. Kendrick," she said, her voice like a whip. "Explain yourself." Tyler straightened, but his smirk faltered. "Just a ticketing issue, ma'am. This gentleman's pass didn't check out. We're handling it." Marissa's gaze shifted to me, and for the first time I saw something like understanding in her eyes. She stepped closer, her voice softening but firm. "Sir, I'm Marissa Delgado. Let's get this sorted out." I nodded, my fingers brushing the photograph in my pocket. I didn't know what was coming. But I'd learned long ago to stand my ground, no matter the odds. The air in Concourse B of Denver International Airport felt like it was holding its breath, the hum of travelers and rolling suitcases fading into a tense murmur. Vernon Hollis stood by the check-in counter at Gate 47, his worn leather satchel at his feet, his navy blazer creased from the day's ordeal. His pale blue eyes, sharp despite his 78 years, held a quiet resolve, the kind forged in the crucible of combat missions long past. The crowd around him buzzed with restless energy, their stares a mix of curiosity, indignation, and impatience. Tyler Kendrick, the gate agent who'd singled him out, leaned against the counter, his slicked-back hair catching the fluorescent light, his smirk barely concealed. Dwayne Carver, the security officer, hovered nearby, his broad frame a silent warning, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Marissa Delgado, the airline's regional supervisor, cut through the tension like a blade. Her crisp blazer and steady stride marked her as someone who didn't tolerate nonsense, and her dark eyes scanned the scene with surgical precision. She stopped in front of Vernon, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. "Mr. Hollis," she said, her voice warm but professional. "I'm Marissa Delgado, regional supervisor for Cascade Airways. I need to hear your side of this." Vernon met her gaze, his voice low and gravelly, tinged with the faint southern drawl of his Georgia youth. "I tried to board with my ticket, business class, seat 3A. Paid for it fair and square 3 weeks ago. Your agent here," he nodded toward Tyler, "said it didn't check out. I offered to show him proof, but he wasn't interested." His words were calm, deliberate, but there was a steel beneath them, the kind that made you listen. Marissa's lips pressed into a thin line as she turned to Tyler. "Mr. Kendrick, explain yourself, now." Tyler straightened, his confidence wavering under her scrutiny, but he clung to his bravado like a lifeline. "The system flagged his ticket, ma'am," he said, his voice louder than necessary, as if he wanted the crowd to back him up. "He doesn't have priority status, and well, look at him." He gestured vaguely at Vernon's faded blazer and scuffed shoes, his tone dripping with condescension. "Business class is for elite passengers. I was just doing my job." A gasp rippled through the crowd, soft but sharp, like a match striking in a quiet room. Vernon's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He'd heard worse in his time. Enemy taunts over crackling radios, officers barking orders in the chaos of war. But there was something about being dismissed in a crowded airport, in front of strangers, that stung deeper than he'd expected. He shifted his weight, his fingers brushing the satchel where his faded photograph lay tucked away, a reminder of who he was. Marissa's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You flagged a valid ticket because of how he looks?" The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The crowd stirred, some passengers nodding, others whispering. The young mother Vernon had helped earlier, her toddler clutching the toy P-51 Mustang, stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "He gave my son a plane," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry. "He was nothing but kind, and you're treating him like some criminal? That's not right!" Her son, oblivious to the tension, waved the toy plane, its chipped paint glinting under the lights. Tyler's smirk faltered, but he doubled down, his voice rising. "Ma'am, I'm following protocol. We can't just let anyone who claims a seat walk on. People try to scam the system all the time. He glanced at Vernon, his eyes cold. No offense, sir, but rules are rules. Vernon's gaze met Tyler's, and for a moment the younger man flinched, like he'd seen something he couldn't quite place. No offense taken, Vernon said, his voice soft but cutting. But I've followed rules my whole life. Paid for that ticket with money I earned, same as anyone else. You're the one bending the rules here, son. The crowd murmured, some clapping softly, others nodding in agreement. A woman in her 60s, leaning on a cane near the gate, pointed at Tyler. That young man's got no manners, she said, her voice carrying. Shame on you treating an elder like that. A teenage boy with earbuds dangling around his neck chimed in, his phone already recording. Yeah, dude's acting like he owns the place. The old guy didn't do nothing. Tyler's face reddened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He glanced at Dwayne for support, but the security officer looked away, his jaw tight, like he was questioning his role in this mess. Marissa pulled out her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she scanned Vernon's boarding pass. The screen lit up, confirming his seat. 3A, business class, paid in full, no flags, no issues. She turned to Tyler, her voice like ice. This ticket is valid. You had no grounds to pull him aside, let alone humiliate him in front of a crowd. Tyler stammered, his bravado crumbling. I was just being thorough, ma'am. The system. The system doesn't tell you to judge a man by his clothes, Marissa snapped, her patience gone. You made a call and it was wrong. You owe Mr. Hollis an apology. The crowd fell silent, every eye on Tyler. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his face a mix of defiance and embarrassment. Vernon stood still, his expression unreadable, but his fingers tightened on the satchel, the only sign of the storm inside him. He didn't want an apology, not from a man who'd already shown his colors. He just wanted his seat, his dignity, and the chance to get to Seattle to see his grandkids. Before Tyler could respond, a new voice boomed from the jetway entrance, sharp and commanding. What in the hell is going on out here? A man in his late 40s, dressed in a pilot's uniform with silver bars on his shoulders, strode into the gate area. His name tag read Captain Javier Torres, and his dark eyes blazed with a mix of irritation and authority. He'd been in the cockpit, running through pre-flight checks, when a flight attendant tipped him off about the commotion. His presence shifted the room, like a general stepping onto a battlefield. Tyler, now visibly flustered, tried to regain control. Captain, it's just a ticketing issue, he said, his voice cracking. We're handling it. Javier's eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping over Tyler, then Marissa, then Vernon. Doesn't look handled to me, he said, his voice low but firm. I see a passenger being held up for no reason, and a crowd that's about to lose its patience. He turned to Vernon, his expression softening. Sir, what's your name? Vernon Hollis, Vernon replied, his voice steady, though he felt the weight of every eye on him. He wasn't one for the spotlight, not now, not ever. Javier nodded, then looked at Marissa. Is his ticket valid? Yes, Marissa said, holding up her tablet. It's been verified. There's no issue. Javier's jaw clenched as he turned back to Tyler. Then why is this man standing here instead of on my plane? His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of command, the kind Vernon remembered from his own days in the cockpit. Tyler's mouth opened, but no words came out. The crowd's sentiment was turning fast, passengers openly siding with Vernon. The woman with the cane spoke up again. I saw the whole thing, she said. That agent was rude from the start, mocked him for no reason. The teenage boy nodded, his phone still rolling. Straight up disrespectful, he said. Marissa, sensing the tide shifting, stepped forward. Mr. Hollis, please, let me escort you to your seat. This shouldn't have happened, and I'll make sure it's addressed. Vernon shook his head, his eyes still on Tyler. I appreciate that, ma'am, he said, his voice soft but firm. But I'd like to know why I was singled out. I've flown this airline for years. Never had a problem until today. There was no anger in his tone, just a quiet demand for answers, the kind that made you feel the weight of your own actions. Javier crossed his arms, his respect for Vernon clear. "That's a fair question," he said, his eyes boring into Tyler. "Care to answer, Mr. Kendrick?" Tyler's face went pale, his hands trembling slightly. It was just a precaution," he stammered. "The system flagged—" "Enough about the system," Javier cut in, his voice sharp. "You made a judgment call and it was dead wrong. You don't get to hide behind a computer screen." The tension was electric now, the gate area a pressure cooker of emotions. Passengers were filming, whispering, clapping. The young mother stood firm, her son's toy plane a silent testament to Vernon's kindness. Marissa's face was a mask of professionalism, but her eyes burned with anger. Dwayne, the security officer, took a step back, his hands at his sides, like he wanted no part of this anymore. Then a voice roared from the back of the crowd, rough and full of life. "Vernon Hollis? Is that Colonel Vernon Hollis?" A man in his 60s, dressed in a faded denim jacket with a Veterans of Foreign Wars patch, pushed through the crowd. His weathered face broke into a grin as he reached Vernon. "I'll be damned, Vern. It's you, ain't it?" Vernon's eyes widened, a rare crack in his composure. "Leroy Tatum?" he said, his voice soft, almost disbelieving. "What are you doing here?" Leroy clapped Vernon on the shoulder, his laugh booming. "Heading to that reunion in Seattle, same as you, I bet. Boys, get over here." Two other men, both in their 60s, wearing veterans' caps heavy with pins, emerged from the crowd. Raynard Gibbs and Malcolm Dorsey, old comrades from Vernon's squadron, their faces lighting up as they saw him. The three of them were part of a group heading to a Vietnam veterans gathering, a detail that caught the gate staff off guard. Leroy turned to the crowd, his voice carrying like a sergeant's on a parade ground. "This man flew 32 combat missions in Vietnam. Saved my sorry hide when our chopper went down in '69. You're telling me he can't board a damn plane?" The crowd erupted, some clapping, others cheering. A woman in a business suit wiped her eyes, her phone forgotten. The teenage boy whooped, his video capturing every second. Tyler's face went white, his hands frozen on the counter. Dwayne looked at the floor, his shoulders sagging. Marissa's expression softened, a mix of respect and regret. "Mr. Hollis," she said, her voice steady but warm, "I had no idea. Please, let's get you on board." Vernon looked at Leroy, then at Javier, then back at Tyler. "I don't want special treatment," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I just want what's mine." Javier nodded, his eyes shining with respect. "And you'll have it," he said, "but I'm not flying this plane until this is sorted out right." He turned to Marissa. "I want a full report on this. And Mr. Kendrick, you're off this gate until we figure out what happened." Tyler's mouth dropped open, but he said nothing. The crowd cheered, the young mother smiling through the tears, her son waving the toy plane. Vernon picked up his satchel, his heart heavy but steady, and followed Marissa toward the jetway, Leroy and his friends trailing behind, their voices loud with pride. As they disappeared into the tunnel, the gate area buzzed with a new energy. Passengers whispered about Vernon, about the pilot's stand, about Tyler's fall. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The jetway to Flight 392 at Denver International Airport felt like a narrow bridge between past and present, the faint hum of the aircraft's engines vibrating through the walls. Vernon Hollis walked with a steady, unhurried gait, his worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder, his faded navy blazer creased from the day's ordeal. At 78, he carried himself with a quiet dignity, his pale blue eyes reflecting a lifetime of trials and triumphs. Beside him was Marissa Delgado, the airline's regional supervisor, her crisp blazer and clipped stride a contrast to Vernon's weathered calm. Behind them trailed Leroy Tatum, Vernon's old comrade from Vietnam, his denim jacket patched with veterans' insignia, his grin wide enough to light up the dim tunnel. The confrontation at Gate 47 still hung in the air, a raw wound that hadn't yet healed. As they stepped into the cabin of the Boeing 737, the business class section greeted them with soft lighting and the gentle clink of glassware. The seats, upholstered in deep gray leather, promised comfort, a far cry from the cramped cockpits Vernon once knew. Passengers already settled in their places glanced up, their expressions a mix of curiosity and indifference. Vernon's seat, 3A, was by the window, its tray table gleaming under the overhead light. Marissa gestured toward it, her voice warm but tinged with regret. "Here you are, Mr. Hollis. I can't apologize enough for what happened back there. If there's anything you need, just let us know." Vernon nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where the tarmac stretched out under the golden glow of the setting sun. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But all I need is to get to Seattle. Got grandkids waiting." There was a faint smile in his words, a flicker of warmth that softened the weight of the moment. Leroy, hovering in the aisle, clapped a hand on Vernon's shoulder. "Too damn modest, Vern," he said, his voice booming with pride. "You ought to be in the captain's seat, not this one." He turned to Marissa, his eyes twinkling. "This man's a hero, ma'am. Flew 32 missions in Nam, saved my sorry hide more times than I can count. You folks should be rolling out the red carpet, not giving him grief." Marissa's expression softened, her professional mask slipping just enough to show genuine respect. "I understand, sir," she said. "We'll make this right. I promise." She excused herself, her heels clicking as she headed toward the cockpit, where Captain Javier Torres was finishing his pre-flight checks. Leroy lingered, joined by Raynard Gibbs and Malcolm Dorsey, the other two veterans from their squadron, their faces creased with grins as they traded quiet jabs about old times. Vernon settled into his seat, stowing his satchel under the chair with care. He reached into his blazer pocket, pulling out the faded photograph he'd shown at the gate. Himself, young and lean in a pilot's uniform, standing beside an F-4 Phantom in a dusty airfield in Da Nang, 1969. His fingers traced the edges, the paper soft from years of handling. He set it on the tray table, not for show, but as a quiet reminder of who he was, who he'd always been. A young flight attendant, Kaylee Harmon, approached, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun, her smile bright but curious. "Mr. Hollis, can I get you something to drink? Water, coffee, maybe a soda?" She glanced at Leroy, who was regaling a nearby passenger with a story about a near miss over the Mekong Delta, his hands waving like he was still in the cockpit. "Water's fine," Vernon said, his voice soft but clear. "Thank you, miss." Kaylee nodded, but her eyes caught the photograph on the tray table. She leaned in slightly, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Is that you, sir?" she asked, her voice hushed with awe. "Were you a pilot?" Vernon's gaze flicked to the photo, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "A long time ago," he said. "Flew Phantoms in Vietnam. Got me through some rough skies." Kaylee's eyes widened, her smile growing. "That's incredible. My granddad was Air Force too, worked on C-130S. He always said pilots were the bravest folks he knew." Vernon chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed to ease the tension in his shoulders. "No braver than the ground crews," he said. "They kept us flying. Your granddad was the real hero." Kaylee beamed, clearly touched, and moved away to fetch his water. But the moment of peace shattered like glass when a sharp voice cut through the cabin. "Miss Delgado, I need to speak with you, now!" Tyler Kendrick, the gate agent who'd started this mess, stood at the front of the business class section, his face flushed with a mix of defiance and desperation. He'd followed Marissa onto the plane, his navy vest askew, his slicked back hair falling into his eyes. "This is getting blown out of proportion," he said, his voice loud enough to turn every head in the cabin. "I was just doing my job." Marissa, standing near the galley, whirled around, her eyes blazing. "Mr. Kendrick, you are not authorized to be on this aircraft," she said, her voice like a whip. "Return to the terminal immediately." Tyler's eyes darted around the cabin, landing on Vernon in seat 3A. "He's the one causing trouble," he said, pointing a trembling finger. "His ticket didn't have the right documentation, and now I'm the bad guy? This is ridiculous!" The passengers gasped, a collective intake of breath that charged the air with tension. Kaylee, still holding her tray of drinks, froze, her eyes wide. Leroy shot to his feet, his denim jacket creaking as he stepped into the aisle. "You got some nerve, kid," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You humiliated a man who's done more for this country than you'll ever dream of. Sit down or get out." Tyler's face twisted, his voice rising to a near shout. "Oh, come on, he's just some old guy with a story. Everyone's got a story." The words landed like a slap, and the cabin erupted in murmurs, passengers shifting in their seats, some pulling out phones to record. Vernon remained seated, his hands folded over the photograph, his gaze fixed on the window. He didn't look at Tyler, didn't raise his voice, but his silence was louder than any shout. He'd faced worse than this: enemy fire, burning jungles, the screams of wounded men. But there was something about being dismissed in a quiet cabin, in front of strangers, that cut deep, like a blade sliding between ribs. Reynard and Malcolm stood now, their veterans' caps tilted back, their faces hard. "You don't know who you're talking to," Reynard said, his voice steady but cold. "That man saved lives. What have you done, kid?" The tension was palpable, the cabin a pressure cooker ready to burst. Marissa stepped forward, her authority unshakable. "Mr. Kendrick, you're done," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Get off this plane or I'll have you escorted out." Before Tyler could respond, Captain Javier Torres emerged from the cockpit, his hat tucked under his arm, his silver bars glinting under the cabin lights. His presence commanded the room, and even Tyler faltered under his gaze. "Mr. Kendrick," Javier said, his voice low and controlled. "You're out of line. Get off my plane. Now!" Tyler's mouth opened, then closed, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. He turned to Marissa, as if expecting her to intervene, but she pointed to the jetway. "You heard the captain," she said. "Go." As Tyler was escorted out, his shoulders slumped, the cabin buzzed with whispers. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others nodding in approval. Kaylee, still frozen with her tray, let out a shaky breath and moved to Vernon's side, setting down his water with a small, folded note. "Thank you for your service." Javier wasn't finished. He turned to the passengers, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay," he said, "but I won't fly this plane until I'm sure every passenger is treated with the respect they deserve, especially those who've earned it." His eyes landed on Vernon, a flicker of recognition passing between them, soldier to soldier. The cabin erupted in applause, spontaneous and heartfelt. Leroy let out a whoop, his fist pumping the air. "That's right, Captain, you tell him." Reynard and Malcolm joined in, their cheers echoing through the cabin. Kaylee smiled at Vernon, who offered a small nod, his fingers still tracing the photograph. Javier approached Vernon's seat, crouching slightly to meet his eye. "Mr. Hollis," he said, his voice low, "I served in the Air Force myself. Gulf War, F-16S. I know what it means to wear that uniform. If there's anything I can do for you, just say the word." Vernon's expression softened, a rare warmth in his eyes. "Just get us to Seattle, Captain," he said, his voice steady. "That's more than enough." Javier nodded, a mutual respect sealing the moment. As he returned to the cockpit, the passengers settled, their earlier impatience replaced by a quiet reverence. The young mother from the gate, now seated in economy, stood and clapped, her son waving the toy plane Vernon had given him. Even the man in the tailored suit, who'd dismissed Vernon earlier, joined in, his face flushed with something like regret. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the cabin lights dimmed, the Rockies fading into dusk outside the window. Over the intercom, Javier's voice crackled, calm but deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Before we take off, I'd like to acknowledge a special passenger on board. Colonel Vernon Hollis, seated in 3A, flew 32 combat missions in Vietnam, saving countless lives, including those of his crew. We're honored to have him with us today." The cabin burst into applause again, louder this time, some passengers standing to catch a glimpse of Vernon. Leroy and his friends cheered, their pride a tangible force. The young mother's applause carried through the curtain from economy, her son's toy plane still in hand. Vernon, caught off guard, looked out the window, his fingers tightening on the photograph. He didn't stand, didn't wave, but his faint smile spoke volumes. A quiet triumph, a restoration of dignity. As the plane lifted off, the ground falling away, the applause faded, but the moment lingered. Vernon Hollis was no longer just an old man in a worn blazer. He was a hero, recognized at last, his past a beacon of honor in a world that too often forgot. Back at the terminal, Tyler sat in Marissa's office, his badge on her desk, his career hanging by a thread. The investigation would come, and with it, consequences. But on Flight 392, Vernon flew toward Seattle, toward his grandkids, his heart steady, his dignity intact.